publishing probably, I think now, more than 16 years, maybe 18 years. I started my editorial career at Penguin. I used to work on the Penguin Classics list. And then I was there for about 2.5 years before I moved to Random House, which is one of the very big publishers. And I worked there for 11 years in total. And then I moved to Bloomsbury a few years ago and set up my imprint called Raven Books. And Raven specializes in books that intrigue, unsettle, and engage, is the way I describe it. So it's books that often have elements of the genre within them. So there are some high concept murder mysteries. I published a book that won the Costa Best First Novel Award last year called The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. I published Gothic ghost stories by a writer called Laura Purcell. I publish an amazing book called Social Creature, which is a kind of female version of The Talent of Mr. Ripley, set in contemporary New York. So I love anything that's got a kind of sense of pace and menace. But in my time in publishing, I have worked on many other books. I've worked on non-fiction, I've worked on literary fiction as well. So what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to talk you through the two sections that are going to be the main components of my job as a publisher. So the first section will look at how I choose the books I want to publish. And then in the second section, I'm going to talk through what then happens when I've bought a book. How do I take it from a manuscript to a finished book that you will see on your bookshelf? I'll start off by talking to you a little bit about the kind of acquiring side of my job. And I'm going to start off by saying that everything I look at is represented by a literary agent, or it might come from a foreign publisher if it's a book in translation. At Bloomsbury, we don't look at anything that's unsolicited, and that's purely really because of a time aspect. Just to give you an idea of how many books I'm sent, I'm normally sent by agents between 200 to 300 books a year. Now, we don't read any of those books during our working hours, because in that time we're doing all the kind of editing, we're talking to our colleagues in publicity and marketing and design. So all of our reading is done in our spare time. So we can't possibly, unfortunately, look at unsolicited submissions as well, because it's actually quite challenging just keeping up with the number we have from agents, especially because they often come at certain times of the year in greater depth. So around the big book fairs, which is in March and October, I might be sent sort of 20 novels a week. And it can be quite hard kind of keeping up with all of those. Just to give you an idea of how many of those books I publish, my list, I would generally publish between 8 to 12 hardbacks a year. But not all of those books will be authors that are new to me. Sometimes when I buy an author, I will buy 2 books by them. So I'm really, out of those 200 to 300 books a year I'm sent, perhaps only looking for 4 or 5 new books. So this, you could look at it and think, okay, that means it's quite hard to get a publishing deal. But actually, I prefer to look at it in the way that actually, if your book is great, it will really stand out. Because a lot of those 200 to 300 books I look at, I actually only need to read the first couple of chapters to realise that it's not quite for me. So when I'm sent those books from agents, sometimes they'll have talked to me about them beforehand and told me how excited they are about them. Sometimes they'll give me a ring. Sometimes it will just be an email that drops into my inbox. And it's one of the nicest things I think about my job, is that I just don't know when something amazing is going to turn up. And sometimes you start reading a book thinking, maybe I like this. And then you find you've read all the way through to midnight and you've been completely engrossed. And I think that's one of the things that all editors absolutely love. We love that kind of element of discovery and finding something really special that you think, this is the one I want to publish. So I would say the things that most editors look for, most publishers will be excited by, is a distinctive narrative voice. So how are you telling your story? And this isn't just for a first-person narrative, it's also for a third-person narrative as well. What we're all looking for really as readers, as editors, as publishers, is a voice that we feel intrigued by or unsettled by or excited by. Whatever emotion we're looking for, depending on the kind of story you're looking to tell us, it has to be a voice that I would want to spend the next 300 to 400 pages with, and countless hours reading it and then editing it and reading it again and again. And I think that's one of the big tests for me, is that because a book, as we'll go on to talk about, goes through a number of different editorial stages, I will end up reading it 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And sometimes I read a book and I think, well, that's great, but I have absolutely no desire to read it again and again and again. Whereas there are some books where you just think, I think the voice is so exciting that I want to be in that company again. And I love reading it because I get to see all the things I might have missed the first time round. I get to marvel at how clever that author's been with their plotting. So it's one of the biggest things that we as publishers look for, is that really distinctive voice that feels like it's doing something new or intriguing or exciting. I'd also say, and it probably sounds quite obvious, but it's worth saying, what we also look for is originality. And I ask people sometimes to think about, what is your one-line pitch for your book? And I know that can be something sometimes really hard for writers to kind of boil it down to. But I think if you can come up with something like that, a hook that instantly makes somebody think, I'd like to know how that works, then you're really already a long way towards engaging their attention. I would always ask, whenever I talk to new writers, ask you to think about, what is the one thing you would say is special about your book? Is it your characters? Is it your plotting? Is it your setting? There'll be one thing. You should have all of those things working brilliantly, but there will be one thing above all else. And I'd encourage you to think about books that you've recommended to people. And how did you recommend them? What were the words you were using when you recommended this book to someone, and why? Because really that's what publishers are doing. I fall in love with a book and then I have to sell it to my colleagues in-house, and then they have to sell it to readers. So it's this kind of process of recommendation. And what is it, if you were thinking about your book, that you just think, I know my characters are absolutely brilliant, or I know I have never seen a book set in, I don't know, a circus in 16th century France, so I know I'm doing something new and different there. So I would say, have a think about what your particular new or different thing is. I'd also, I love to see in books ambition. It doesn't matter if the author doesn't always pull off everything, but I love to see someone that's taking a chance to do something different. They're not just telling a story I have read numerous times. They've really thought about, how can I tell the story in a different way? What can I do to make my character more interesting? And I think this is particularly true if any of you are writing genre fiction, whether that's romance or YA or crime. There tend to be certain tropes in all of those genres that readers love, but how can you take that trope and make it feel fresh? What can you do to make those characters, that setting you're writing, stand out? One of the alarm bells, I would say, that often rings for me if I'm talking to kind of would-be authors, is when they say they don't read. And the one thing I would say to you, if you take no advice from the rest of this talk, is that you cannot be a good writer without being a good reader at the same time. You have to be interested in other people if you want to be a writer. And I think one of the easiest ways to be interested in people is to be a reader, to want to put yourself in other people's shoes, to think, how would I have reacted in that circumstance? So I would encourage all of you to read as widely as possible. Doesn't matter if it's not in the genre you're reading it, you're writing in, because I think you can always learn something from the books. Whether it's, I thought that was terrible and I will never do that in a book of my own, or whether you just think that's a really interesting way of approaching a very difficult subject, or I've never thought about giving that kind of character a voice before. I would say you will never waste any time by reading a book, and it will improve your writing immeasurably. What I also look for is a well-structured and focused book that doesn't lose sight of the main goal of your lead character. And I have read so many books that have been sent to me by agents that start brilliantly, and then about halfway through it becomes clear that the author is telling a very different story. And maybe they were concerned that nobody would be interested in that story, so they've tried to sort of smuggle it in by starting in a different way. So I would say, do be honest with yourself about what book are you trying to tell? And what book do you really want to tell at your heart? I had an interesting conversation with one of my authors who said that when she started, she wanted to be a literary writer. So she wrote, as she says, terrible literary fiction. And then eventually, sort of 3 or 4 attempts in, she realized that actually what she was really good at was writing incredibly smart social issues crime books. But she had to kind of be realistic with herself about that. What she loved to read wasn't actually what she wanted to write. And once she got that working together, then everything kind of unlocked for her. So I would think about that when you're writing your book as well. And leading on from that, I would say what I look for is a clear understanding of the genre you're writing in and what those expectations will be within that genre. So if you're writing a thriller, are there plenty of twists and turns? If you're writing a romance, are the characters that you feel people would take to their hearts? And why are you writing in that genre in the first place? Are you writing a crime book because you think it's easy to sell? Or are you writing a children's book because J.K. Rowling is done fantastically? Or are you writing those books because you absolutely love them? And I always sort of ask people to really kind of think about that and think about the genre they're writing in, because you want to challenge that genre and you want to do something different within it. But you do also have to understand the expectations of your reader. And say, if you are writing a romance, for example, your main character doesn't want to follow a very predictable arc where she gets together with the man of her dreams and all is fine. She can find love in a very different way, whether that's realizing that she's fulfilled through her job or her friendships. But you do, if you're writing a romance, you will need to have a happy ending, or you're going to end up with some very disappointed readers at the end of it. And what I also look for is clarity of writing. So that's things like not weighing the book down with unnecessary detail, lots of descriptive passages that kind of kill the momentum dead. I want books that use their descriptive passages effectively, and really, rather than just showcasing the amount of research you might have done, what detail can you put in to bring this world alive to me? Certain books will require a lot more description and scene setting than others. So, the difference between, say, a Lee Child and a Hilary Mantel, you'll be able to tell there's an enormous amount of detail in Hilary's books, but that's because she's creating a very different world. But the description she includes is still clear and focused and necessary. There's not kind of endless pages that we don't need. And quite often when I get books in, especially historical fiction, I don't know if any of you are writing that, but quite often you can tell that someone's done so much research and they've discovered all these fantastic things, and then they try and put all of those fantastic things in one book. And you think, oh no, wait, I was trying to follow a story, and instead I've got this whole kind of like digression into the kind of colours of clothes that they wore in that particular time. It's not doing anything. So I would say, think about that kind of clarity of writing as well. And I would say, for those of you that are proposing to write a series, the couple of you that are, whether that's fantasy, YA, crime, you need characters that I want to spend time with again and again. I need to put down that first book feeling that you have created characters so incredibly well drawn that there is the potential to tell multiple stories about them, each as exciting as the last. And I actually have this with one of my books, which is a book called The House on Half Moon Street by a writer called Alex Reeve. And it is about someone who is transgender living in Victorian London. So again, that was a kind of premise which I thought was really fascinating. I'd never seen a kind of character like that, who obviously wouldn't identify as trans because the concept didn't exist, but was living that kind of life. And he had written this book that was so full of vivid characters that I rang up the agent and I said, is this meant to be a standalone, or is he going to write a series? Because I want to spend more time with him. And she was like, I'm so glad you said that, because we were thinking it would be a series, but we didn't want to put anybody off at the time. And I'm now just about to publish his third book, in fact, because he's so brilliant and he did such a great job of creating not just an amazing lead character, but also various supporting characters that then he could bring in and out. So if you are writing a series, look at giving yourselves the potential to build up your world and your universe. I was going to say also briefly about things that might turn me off in a book. I would say generally there is no one area, one subject, one scene you can't do in writing. If you are a good writer, you can tackle anything, I would say. So please don't worry if you think I could never write a book about this or write like that. If you're writing sympathetically, empathetically, you can, I would say, write about anything. There are various things I am less excited by on a personal level working in my genre. I'm not particularly pleased with it. There's a vast number of books out there that I think glamorize male violence against women, and I'm very tired of books where it opens with, a woman's naked corpse being found and a male detective investigating that, because I just think we have read that story a million times. I just feel like that adds nothing to the discussion. I also am not wild about books that feel rushed. So I mention this because, and I don't know if this is a question any of you might have, but I've been asked a few times since this has happened whether people should write books about coronavirus, about the pandemic. And my opinion is you shouldn't change what you're writing right now. If you're writing a book and you feel like you need to retrofit references to the pandemic in, I think it's going to feel slightly awkward. It's going to feel clumsy. It's not going to feel an integral part of the book. So my advice is try not to rush books to capitalize on what might be happening in the world. Now, there's nothing to say that you might not do very well and there might be another publisher that could publish that kind of thing fantastically. But I would always say it's so much better to take your time over a book and ensure it is in the best possible state, especially when you're sending something to an agent. Whenever I talk to friends of mine who are agents, I think one of the biggest things that comes up for them is people sending them books too early in the process. They finish the book, they think, I'm done, they email it off to the agent, and then about 3 weeks later they email and they say, I read it again and I realised I've got to make some changes, so here's a new draft and here's a new draft. So I always say it's really worth taking your time on your book. However delighted you probably are to get to the end of it, I would really say the best thing you can do is then put your manuscript aside for a month, maybe 6 weeks, and then come back to it and read it again, because you will inevitably spot kind of things that you would like to change. And this still happens with my authors when they send drafts into me. Occasionally I've had them when they've emailed and they said, actually, I read it again over the weekend and I haven't got something completely right. But I would say, really, as with reading around your subject, giving your manuscript a little bit of time to breathe before you send it onto an agent will be invaluable. And I think I can certainly tell when I look at early material when someone's kind of rushed it out and when someone's really taken their time to kind of think it through. What do I not care about when I'm choosing books? Just to reassure you, I don't care whether you've done a creative writing MA. I don't care. Several of my authors haven't been to university. It's not relevant. What's relevant is the book you're sending. So please don't worry, because this comes up a lot, that you have to have done some kind of creative writing, that you have to have done an English degree, that you have to have done something like that. You absolutely do not. It's not true. I don't care either whether you have a social media following. If you're writing a certain type of non-fiction, it can be helpful to have a kind of following. But if you're writing fiction, really doesn't matter. A willingness to engage on social media can be really helpful for us, but we have plenty of authors that don't like doing it, don't want to do it, and that is what your publisher is there to do. We can handle that for you. So if that's not something you feel comfortable with, that is not a prerequisite of writing a good book. And also, we really don't care about your age either. I see this come up a lot, that people think that if a debut has to be in your 20s or in your 30s. That's not true at all. I think, again, agents and editors just want the best books. And in fact, the author I mentioned, the House on Half Moon Street author, Alex Reeve, was shortlisted for a prize last year called the Christopher Bland Prize. And it is for writers who've written their first book over the age of, I think it's 50. And it was lovely seeing the kind of lineup of authors on that list, because it was for fiction and non-fiction. And it was won by the author who wrote The Salt Path, if any of you have read that. And also on the list was A.J. Pearce, who wrote Dear Mrs. Bird, which was a Sunday Times bestseller. All of those authors came to writing later in life. And I think it's really important to understand that you do not have to be kind of young, media-friendly, living in London for anyone to be interested in your book. It's just not. And I think particularly now we've all been working at home and doing so much more online, I think the fact that you can be based anywhere in the country or indeed in the world will be even less of a problem now, because we can do so much virtually. Now, that is a good question, because I think a lot of people tend to give manuscripts to friends and family who are generally going to say nice things about your book. I would really recommend finding a writing group if you can find one. There are lots of them online, so even if there isn't one in your particular area, you should be able to find one. And I know various authors who found it completely invaluable to have somebody else who can look at their work with that kind of critical eye. My one note of caution would be to find the writing group that works for you. So I taught one of the Vapor Academy courses last year, and one of the really smart people on that had been in a couple of writing groups, and she said the first one was just mean. There were a couple of people in there that just ripped apart everybody's books, and that I don't think is helpful. What you're looking for is someone who can be constructive and can ask you questions. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be people that are writing in the same genre as you, although that might be helpful. But I'd really recommend it, because also not only are you getting feedback, but you are getting used to giving other people feedback. And much like reading lots of other books, reading other people's work in progress, I think, can be really helpful for you to work out issues in your own books. Because if you're seeing that somebody else is having a problem and you're trying to help them fix it, it will often unlock a problem in your own mind. So I would suggest that. There are also various paid services you can do, various manuscript assessments. But again, I don't feel you have to go down that route, and certainly a lot of people don't have access to the funds for that. So I would suggest finding a writing group in person or online would be a great way to start. I have a couple that are very close to my heart. Actually, one of them I was going to talk to you a little bit about, which I mentioned briefly, is this book, which I realise you might not be able to see because it's reversed, which is The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which is the book that won the Costa Best First Novel Award. And I take that book to my heart because I love it and I love the author enormously. But also it's one of those occasions where it felt like the kind of stars aligned. So when I moved to Bloomsbury to set up Raven Books, and I went out to see various agents and I said, please send me these kind of books. And I kept saying, I really want a high concept murder mystery. And I just want something really ambitious. I'm so bored of reading exactly the same book over and over again. And then an agent who at the time I didn't know at all sent me this book. And the pitch for it was, it's Groundhog Day meets Gosford Park. And I just thought, what? And the premise of this book is, it takes place in a kind of a big country house with a sort of 1920s, 1930s feel to it. And everyone's gathered together for this big party. At the end of the party at midnight, the daughter of the house, Evelyn Hardcastle, is murdered. And our narrator is told, until he can solve her murder, the day will keep repeating itself over and over again, like Groundhog Day. The catch being that every time the day starts afresh, he wakes up in somebody else's body in the party, and he has no control over whose body it is. So he starts off as a cowardly doctor. He becomes an obese businessman at one point. He becomes a caddish playboy. He becomes the butler. And it was just one of the most inventive books I'd ever read. Ambitious, bizarre, and it was just nothing like anything I'd read. And what actually made, I think, is more interesting as well, is that lots of editors who were sent it didn't know what to do with it. They were like, what is this book? Is this science fiction? Is this historical fiction? Is this murder mystery? And so lots and lots of people passed on it because they just thought, I can't quite see how to publish it. Whereas we just absolutely loved it. I loved it, and my colleagues all absolutely loved it. And I think what makes me incredibly happy is that that was a book where it didn't look at the start, it wasn't one of those books that came kind of very hyped. It wasn't a huge auction with lots of publishers bidding on it. It was just a really brilliant book. And since it's been published and it's done so well, I keep now seeing other books being compared to it, which is always a kind of nice sign as an editor and an author, when you know you've made it when someone's saying, oh, it's like The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. So that is one that is very close to my heart, I think. But I think all of our debuts always are very close to your heart because you generally know how hard someone's worked on that book as well. And I will say, however long I work in publishing, I still get so excited every time a finished copy of one of my books arrives, because it's just the nicest thing. Something that came into your inbox as an email attachment is now a physical object I can kind of pick up and give to people. And I don't think that kind of wears off. I don't know. I think, trends come in publishing as they do in kind of film, in art and everything. I don't know if I'd say there's anything missing right now. I think there are, in fact, I'd say the opposite way. In fact, I think we're seeing some more stories that might not have been told 10 years ago. So I think publishing is trying to make a concentrated effort to represent more voices that might not have been published 10, 15 years ago. And that's diversity, not just in race, but in class, in kind of gender, sexuality, and all kind of things like that. And I'm trying to think now what I was publishing 10 years ago and what's different now. I think, I don't know. I think what's interesting is that you will see trends and you will see them kind of peak. So some of you might know, depending on your reading taste, that perhaps 10 years ago, I think there was a lot of chick lit. So a lot of that kind of Sophie Kinsella type books. They've kind of gone away a little bit more now. But what perhaps took their place was psychological thrillers. So things like The Girl on the Train, which did so well a few years ago. So then we had a real raft and everything was a kind of psychological thriller with an unreliable narrator. And it'll be interesting to know what the next trend is. And I don't think anybody knows quite yet. There's kind of various things sort of bubbling away. But I think it's... I think if that's what, if you're asking the question in the sense of, oh God, there's something I'm not doing in my books, don't worry, just, focus on your book. And it's really good to have a sense of the market and what is doing well, but don't expect that you're having to compete with every book out there. You're only having to compete with the kind of books that are doing a sort of similar thing to you in some cases, if that helps. Good question. And I think I've had it before in different ways about kind of leaving open unresolved endings. I think you have to decide for yourself how much satisfaction you're going to be giving the reader. So I think if you want to have it that your characters walk off and we don't know if they're going to get together and we don't know if they're going to stay apart, that is absolutely fine, providing we feel that something else has changed in your character's life. I think one of the things you want to avoid really when you're writing a book is if your character feels the same at the end of the book as they were at the beginning. There needs to be, as we'll talk about a little bit more in the editing section, progression in your character, because otherwise, why are we following this character? Why are we kind of invested in them? So if at the end of your romance novel, your character has learned something, has changed, has got a greater understanding of themselves, I think you possibly can leave it a little bit more open-ended. But I think you have to be aware of what else you might be offering the readers to give them some sense of satisfaction at the end of a book. And similarly, I've been asked this in relation to crime books, whether you can leave crime books unresolved. There are some books that have done that and done that very well. It can be frustrating for readers if you've asked them to invest in this book and a mystery and then there is no resolution at the end. They can feel kind of cheated by that. So again, what else might you be offering them? Have you offered them a real sense of how these investigations actually might play out in the real time, and you brought about some kind of resolution, just not the final identity of the killer? Or are you just leaving them? Are you going to end the book and we're just going to sit there feeling incredibly frustrated, or we follow this story and there's been absolutely that kind of no conclusion? So I think it's up to you to kind of work out what else you might be offering the reader that might compensate perhaps for the lack of a killer being charged, or the lack of a wedding at the end of your romance novel, for example. So most publishers don't accept unsolicited submissions anymore. Some will. The same with agents, though. It's always on their website. So have a look. And look very specifically at the agent guidelines, because they will vary, and some agencies will ask you to send the first 3 chapters, some will ask you to send a synopsis in the first 3 chapters. Most are very, very clear and kind of straightforward, and nobody's asking you usually for anything particularly controversial. The standard with agencies is usually your first 3 chapters and a synopsis. Some will vary a little bit, but almost everybody, I think, will have it very clearly on their website to make it as clear as possible. It's really worth paying attention to those kind of things, because I know an agent I was speaking to today said she gets between 40 to 50 submissions a week. So she's getting 250 submissions a month. And she said so many of them are so easy to reject because the people haven't followed any of the guidelines on their website. So really, even if you think you know what they might be asking, it's always worth having a look. And occasionally some agents will close their list of submissions while they try and catch up. So it's worth having a look just in case they've closed at that point, because there's nothing worse than you writing this wonderful kind of covering letter and doing a brilliant synopsis and then just sending it to someone who isn't particularly looking at that right time, or doesn't represent what you do. I've spoken to so many agents who don't represent, for example, fantasy, but are sent fantasy, or they don't represent children's books and are sent children's books. So just, even if you think you know, have a look on their website. If any of you are on social media, a lot of agents are on Twitter particularly and are very good and responsive. Don't ever try and pitch your book to them, but they're more than welcome normally if you would say, I can't find your submissions guidelines. They will normally help. And if you are on Twitter, if you look under the hashtag #AskAgent, quite often UK agents will be there answering questions, and it can be really helpful. 4 of them did it today, and we're asking all the kind of questions about submissions and, you know, what you might put in a covering letter and things like that. So it's definitely worth going and having a look at something like that. And again, the same, if there are publishers that open their submissions, and some smaller publishers definitely do, it should be on their website exactly what they're looking for, who to send it to, who to address it to, all of that kind of information. Assuming you have written a book that has all of those things I loved, it has clarity, it has originality, it has a brilliant voice, and I just fell in love with it, and so did all of my colleagues, and we bought it. What's the next steps we do? So I'm going to talk you through them all quickly now, and then we'll break it down in a little bit more detail. There are 2 different forms of editing that I do: a structural and a line edit. And depending on the book and what work is needed, these might sometimes be combined into one edit, or they might be done as separate stages. A book may only need 1 detailed edit, and it may have many, it may need several drafts. I recently worked on something where it took us 8 drafts before we got the book exactly as we wanted it to. Other books, it might only take 1 or 2. Once the author and I are happy with it, the book is then given to someone called a copy editor, who's almost always a freelancer now. And they ensure that things like the punctuation and the grammar are all correct. They will check details like if you've got Wednesday, the 25th of March, 1947, they will check that that definitely was a Wednesday. And were pineapples commonly available in Durham, like you're saying they are. They'll also check that the book is laid out properly on the page so that it starts, so it can be typeset, which is when it starts looking like a real book rather than looking kind of like a Word document. Just to reassure you, because it's come up before when I've done talks, a copy editor won't correct any punctuation or grammar if it's deliberately incorrect. So if you're telling a whole book through dialect, for example, someone like Irvine Welsh's Train Spotting, the copy editor isn't going to put all of that into kind of proper formal English. So don't worry about that. The editor and the copy editor will discuss the rules of the book beforehand. So if you're using lots of slang, if you're using up made up language, that won't be corrected, don't worry. So once a book has been typeset, a proofreader will then look at that alongside the author and make sure no mistakes have been introduced and sometimes catch any remaining plot holes. So essentially, if your book is bought by a publisher, you're going to have at least 3 pairs of eyes looking at your book after the agent has worked on it. More if there's a US editor involved. Often I will ask my assistant to read something with me as well. So all of these people will be working together to make sure your book is as brilliant as it can possibly be. This is partly why it takes what seems, I think, from the outside, such a long time for a book to be published. So generally, from the point of acquisition, so the point I buy a manuscript from an agent, the point of publication is 12 months. And we need all of that time to do all of these stages, all these different edits, and also make sure we've got the cover right, talk to our publicist, talk to everybody like that, discuss the marketing campaign. I know sometimes it sounds kind of awful. You spent so long writing your book and you finally got a publishing deal and then someone says it's not coming out for another 12 months. But I promise you there are normally very good reasons for that. And I had one of my authors, I'm publishing his debut in February. And he was appalled when I told him it was going to be at least 12 months, and it's actually slightly longer till his book was published. He said, but I wanted it published before I was 50. And then he recently wrote to me to say, I now understand, and thank God we had so much time to do all of the editing and things like that. So we are normally doing a lot of things behind the scenes. So I want to now break down what those stages are that I talked to you about, the structural and line edit. So you know what the process will involve, but also so you can go back and look at your manuscripts, your books, and see if there's anything you might be able to tweak before you send it to an agent, before you consider self-publishing, whatever your next stages are. So the structural edit, as the name might imply, is looking at the overall shape and structure of your book. And I'm going to list lots of things here and then go back to them in detail. So areas I would look at in a structural edit include, how does the book unfold? Does it start well but then sag in the middle, which almost all books generally do on their first draft? Is the ending rushed? Do the character arcs make sense? Are motivations clear and understandable? Do the characters ever do something completely at odds with their portrayal just for the demands of the plot? Do we have enough subplots in there? A lot of books I read on submission are quite thin, so they'll have that main mystery, but they haven't kind of put anything else in to develop the book further. Similarly, some books have so much going on that I lose track of what the main thread is, and it's kind of overwhelming. Is there enough drama and is there enough tension? It isn't just books within the crime or thriller genre that need tension. Even a rom-com needs to have something that makes us want to keep reading and invest in the fate of your characters. Even the happiest of books need to have conflict to make for an interesting read, and there has to be some kind of a sense that your character has something to lose, whether that's their job or their home or a more emotional thing, like the respect of their family or a friendship that's kept them going through a really dark period. If there is nothing personally at stake for your characters, there isn't really a book, I would say. And as an example of that, I did quite a lot of work recently with one of my authors, so with her second book with me, where she delivered the book and the protagonist started off in such a miserable way. They were so depressed, their marriage was terrible, they hated their job, their family, were not great. And things then got progressively worse. And we had to, as part of our edit, we had to work on making sure that she had some positive things in her life at the beginning. So it felt like there was something to lose when then worse things happened to her. In a line edit, after the structural edit's done, or possibly at the same time if it doesn't need a big structural edit, we're looking closely at the book line by line. So it's really sort of drilling down into your word choice. Does the author have any tics that they might overuse? Everybody does, just to reassure you. All of you will have particular words or phrases that you kind of use and reuse. I've had authors that use, I padded, I took a deep breath, I shrugged. We just had it, one of my authors, the US editor, called that they said, I realized a lot, and we counted This is why being able to edit on screen is very helpful. I think it was 87 times in a manuscript that her character realised that, and we had to change some of those. Does the language you're using seem appropriate to your characters? So, for example, is a teenager using a very formal words that seem at odds with their background? Was that slang commonly used in the Victorian period? How does the language flow? I talked before about the kind of clarity of language. Are we getting bogged down in lots of long, clumsy sentences that are distracting from the pacing you're building? And also, do we have enough detail for a reader unfamiliar with this location and time to be able to build up a picture for themselves? And I would say, as a tip to you all, one of the best ways to improve your writing is to read it out loud. It's an absolutely brilliant way of catching repetitions, and also catching really messy, overlong sentences, because it's very easy for your eye to skim over it when it's printed out. But when you start to read it out loud, you realise that it's gone on for about 7 paragraphs, just this one sentence. So I would thoroughly recommend that when you have finished your work and you're ready to start editing, you print it out and you read it out loud. The most important thing, I think, to remember with any edits is that this is a conversation between you, the writer, and the editor. It's never a list of orders. It's your name that's on the front cover of that book, so you have to be happy with everything that happens within it. But whenever I suggest edits, I always provide an explanation for why I'm suggesting something. It's never just like, I don't like dogs in books. It's always like, I think the dog in this case is distracting from this or that or whatever's happening. And I would always say to people that generally it's much better for me to point something out in a kind of private conversation between the two of us than it is for a reviewer to point it out in the national paper or an Amazon reviewer to pick it up. In my experience, authors love being edited. You know, they can see how seriously their editor's taking their writing, and writers I know want that rigor and they want to make their book as good as it can be. So I think because I'm always providing an explanation for why I'm making a suggested change, they understand where it's coming from. Because I think this is, my mum always asks me this. She's always like, well, what if they don't like what you're saying? And I'm like, well, normally we're talking about it and we talk about why I'm suggesting it and how that might help. And some authors will have very different ways of dealing with it. So some of my authors love it if I point out a problem and leave them to fix it. Others like it if I point out a problem and suggest potential solutions, which they might follow, or they might come back with something else. Every author will, have their own way of working, as does every editor. Areas that I do tend to see a lot in books I work with and talk to the authors quite a lot about. Books that are too slow to get started. I would say one writer I know, very brutally, suggested that you could lose at least the first 3 chapters of any book. I'm not quite sure that's true of every book, but I think it's certainly true that I read a lot of books where you just think, I do not need all of this preamble, and I just want us to get to where something interesting is kind of happening to us. Endings are very often rushed, especially in early drafts, I think. I just read a submission, in fact, where there were about 4 major plot twists in the last 20 pages, which meant none of them really landed because I didn't have a chance to take any of them in before you're rushing off to the next one. I would say really think about the length of your book. If people have spent 300-400 pages following this story, they're probably going to be disappointed if it's all wrapped up in 2 pages. Similarly, if you've written a novella and it's maybe only 70 pages long, if it then takes 30 more pages to end, people are probably going to start to feel a little bit bored. So kind of judge the length of your ending really on the length of your submission overall, and try not to do too many plot twists if they're kind of reducing the impact of them. It's better to have, I think, one great plot twist than it has a series of lots of them which just undermine one another. Plotting largely depends not just on your skill as a writer to plot, but it depends on having well-drawn 3-dimensional characters. Because if I don't believe your characters would take those actions, I'm never going to believe in the book itself. And I think it's worth remembering that I don't have to like your characters. I don't have to think that I would have acted in that same way if I was them. But what I have to do is believe that that character would have done that. You have convinced me that even though it seems entirely illogical to me, that character completely would have thrown something out of the window or said no to that engagement or whatever it was. And if I don't believe in that, I'm not going to believe in your book at all. So even if your plot is brilliant and ingenious, if I don't believe in the characters, it's not going to go anywhere. And I would also say, on a character note, do remember, and this is something I do quite a lot of work with authors, you don't have to tell us everything about your character as soon as you introduce them. I think this is one of the most common issues I see in kind of newer writers. You can drip feed information throughout the book, and indeed you should do that, because it's much more interesting for us to learn about a character piece by piece. And not just learning from that character, but learning from how other people react to that character as well, especially if any of you are writing unreliable narrators. You know, it's really important that we see them through other characters' eyes as well. And I always say to people, think about it when you meet someone new at a party, at a shop, in the office. Rarely does anyone walk up to you and say, hello, I'm Alison, I'm 38 years old, I live here, I do this. Your characters shouldn't do that either. You know, sometimes it will take a really long time for certain bits of information to come out. Sometimes a character might not know something about themselves. They might be completely convinced they are always a very happy-go-lucky person and be entirely unaware that that's not how they come across. So I would kind of think about how your characters are coming across, and if you're leaving space for the reader to invest in the book. And I think that's probably one of my top tips, is giving your book and the reader time to breathe. So sometimes when I read submissions, so much is happening, and I think it comes from a kind of anxiety that readers might get bored and they might put the book down, so people feel they have to constantly be adding new things in. But actually, sometimes you need to give your characters time to take in a bit of information. I've read numerous books where a character is told something completely kind of earth-shattering. They're told they're adopted, they're told that someone's died, and they just carry on as normal, and they never have a moment, which I think most of us would, where we sort of reel. And we might not do that initially, but there will probably be a moment where you have to stop and take in what you've been told, and that gives your reader a chance to take in what they're being told as well. Because if everything happens too quickly, your readers are never having a chance to form their own opinions of the characters, to speculate, to kind of engage with your story. And that's what you want to do. You want to leave that space in your book so that a reader can kind of come in and join you in that story. So that's a good question. So it kind of depends on different publishers, and some will be more driven by certain departments. So at Bloomsbury, we're very lucky that we're very editorially led. So if the editors really fall in love with the book, generally, and we can get the support of our colleagues in-house, then that normally works brilliantly. Some publishers are perhaps more driven by their sales team, saying whether they think they can sell many copies of the book. But just to give you an idea of who we would like to get on board, so I would like to get my publicists on board. I want them to be thinking, yep, there is definitely, I think this book would get reviews. I think there are interesting features that this author might write about the research in this book, or why they've finally written a book at 74, or conversely, why they've written a book at 13. I would like my marketing team to be excited by it. And so the marketing team will be the people that do, if you've seen adverts on social media, like on Facebook and things like that, they will, if you have a very big book, produce the posters you will see on the tube or by train stations. I will want my colleagues in sales to get on board, and that's colleagues not just in the UK who sell to people like Waterstones and WH Smiths and Amazon, but also my colleagues in international sales who deal with English language bookshops all across the world. So we sell our books in so many other countries outside of the UK, and often those sales can be quite significant. So in Germany particularly, so many people speak English so brilliantly that English language book sales in Germany can sometimes be even greater than English language book sales in the UK, which is extraordinary for certain authors. I will also, is there anything else I would like to get on board? I think those are the key people you need to get on board. You sign it off. And depending on how much money we might have to pay for the book, which will depend on how many other publishers want to buy it, we would also maybe have to get the kind of senior management team above me going up to our CEO of Bloomsbury to say, yes, you can have that much money to offer for it. But generally, that's only for very big books, and you don't have to have that on a kind of everyday basis. It kind of depends on why I wasn't sure about launching the author. So sometimes I run quite a small list. I'm the person that kind of runs it, and I now have one other person that works with me, but we don't publish many books. And one of the guiding principles of my list has always been that we wouldn't want authors to compete with each other. So I publish a writer who writes brilliant Gothic ghost stories. I probably wouldn't want to publish another author who also wrote Gothic ghost stories, because they'd be going for exactly the same prizes, review space, readership, all of that. So if I read an amazing ghost story, but I just thought they're too similar to something I already have signed up, then in that case, I would probably have to regretfully let somebody else publish it. And it has happened in the past that I've read things that are very good, but I just think, you know what, they are in a similar territory to somebody else I'm publishing. So I'm going to say no. And in fact, I would say that probably is the case with many other editors as well, that they would have a similar thing, that sometimes you might have just bought a book on a very similar subject. It's funny how this can happen sometimes. So I'm publishing in October and spring of next year 2 books that are both set on ships, both of them historical fiction. And then I had a 3rd book sent to me that was also set on a ship in the kind of historical period. And I was like, I can't have another ship book on my list. So hopefully another editor out there had no ship books on their list and was delighted to have one on there. But that could be why. But I think that would be the only reason I would really have to say no. The other thing, I suppose, is if an author had been published by various other publishing houses and had got lovely reviews but hadn't managed to sell at many of those publishers, it can be quite challenging to relaunch somebody quite a way in their career, because what happens when bookshops order copies of books is they look at what the author has sold previously. So if they can see lots and lots of quite modest sales, they might not support the book in the way we would want to. So in that case, if we're taking on an author who's already been published by several different publishing houses and has a track record, at that point, that's the kind of conversation I need to have with my colleagues of what can we say that's new, what can we say that's exciting, what can we say to make everybody take this as seriously as we want it to. And it's why you will sometimes see that some authors write under pseudonyms. So it might be that they've written a couple of books and they perhaps haven't quite worked, or they've been in a very different genre, so they will write under a different name. So Paula Hawkins, who wrote The Girl on the Train, had written kind of romance things previously and under a pseudonym. Paula Hawkins is her real name. If anyone's read The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley, she'd written a couple of other books, and then this was her first thriller. So they kind of went out and launched it almost as if she was a debut writer. So there are ways that publishers can try and get around that issue, but it can sometimes be a little challenging for us. So it just means we have to think extra hard before we kind of took that on. But if we absolutely love the book, we can always find a way, I think, of justifying any acquisition. What I would say is that readers are surprisingly prudish when it comes to language. So I find this astonishing that people that will happily read books about really gruesome murders and really kind of violent sexual acts get incredibly offended by swearing in books in a way that just doesn't seem to happen with TV and film. So my advice, and I have to do this quite a lot with a couple of my authors, is to try and keep the swearing to a minimum. I don't think you should take it out entirely unless this is with the obvious caveat that you're not writing children's books, in which case slightly different rules will apply. But I would say try and keep swearing to a minimum, much less than you would expect to see in TV, film, real life. People really do get offended. They write quite strong letters and complaints on Amazon and things like that. So I would say once or twice if it's justified, but generally it might be a bit of a problem. And again, I think what's probably important there is to get a sense of the kind of books it might be read alongside. So again, I would expect to see swearing in experimental literary fiction. I'd expect to see it in crime and thrillers. If you're writing romance, probably not. I don't think it would necessarily be as welcome there. Again, I don't know science fiction and fantasy as well, but I imagine it probably jars there too. So that's probably another one of going back to what I said about knowing the expectations of your genre. If people are fine with a bit of swearing, then you'll be fine with your own bit of swearing. But if it's not something that seems to happen in books in that area, I'd steer clear of it if possible. But no editor will reject something just because it's got swearing. If everything else is brilliant, I'll just have a conversation with you as part of the edit to say, unfortunately, can we take out a bit of this and just make sure we use it when it's really, really effective. No, there are various kind of guidebooks on creative writing exercises, which it might be worth, if you're kind of interested in that, buying, because I quite often recommend that if you're stuck in a manuscript, particularly when people get to a point where they're blocked, it's quite fun to sometimes go off and do a kind of smaller exercise, because I think it almost unlocks a different part of your brain. Personally, though, I still reckon that reading widely in fiction is as valuable as reading a kind of practical how-to guide, because I just think you absorb so much, and it's, again, like I say, even if you don't like the book, that can be super useful because it makes you think, why did I think that book didn't work? And what would I have done if I was writing that? How might I have solved that problem? So I think often that can be really useful, even reading, bad books that you might not normally read. But yeah, there is also a book, I think it's called How Not to Write a Novel, which kind of sends up all the cliches of what you're supposed to not do and do. And that, I remember looking at that and thinking that was quite kind of accessible and funny and not too serious, which I quite enjoyed in its style.